Good morning, church. Hope you've been well. Today, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 16, and we're going to look at a very interesting story, a short passage though, but we're going to read the whole chapter of Genesis 16. So if you can turn to Genesis 16, we're going to read from verse 1 to verse 15. Let me read that for you, chapter 16. And if you can, do follow the story as we read the chapter. Now, Sarai, who is Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children, so go and sleep with my servant, and perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat Sarai with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she is pregnant, she treats me with contempt. And the Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abram replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." And then he added, "I will give you more descendants than you can count." And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. And this son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. And yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives." And therefore Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me, Elroy." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named EL-ROI, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. One of my favorite riddles goes like this: what is the one thing which belongs to you but is most used by others? Your name. Okay. I know the people whom I've asked the riddle before sitting here, they are the ones who answered. But the name is the one thing which belongs to you, but other people use the most, right? Names are very important. Names are very meaningful. And when it comes to names, there are quite some interesting facts. There's this family in the US, very strangely wanted to name their children all the alphabet letters. They had about 15 children, and so they named in the alphabetical order all their children. So A, B, C, D went all the way to O. Names are very interesting. And when I was born, the first name given to me was not Ashwin, it was Reuben. And then somebody told my parents, that's a Christian name, please change, the name to Ashwin. Then years later, I became a Christian and still have the name Ashwin. And some names are very hard to live up to. Think of the name Pretty. Imagine you have a name, called Pretty. How do you live? Like the pressure every day. When it comes to names, there's a concept called aptronym. And what it means is, when a name matches the person's occupation or the person's character or the person's personality, it's called an aptronym. And there are many famous personalities as well who have such a name. Usain Bolt. What a great fast runner. And he's got the name Bolt as his second name. William Wordsworth, a very famous poet who used many words. Sarah Blizzard. She's a weather reporter on TV. Dr. Kneebone. Do I have to tell you? He's an ortho doctor. Scott Speed, a professional race car driver. All acronyms, no? Names that happen to match your personality, your character, or something you do, something that has to do with your life. In the story that we read, just now in Genesis 16, we read about a character called Hagar who gives a name to God, and it's an acronym in a sense. And you know what? Quite interestingly, she becomes the first person in the entire Bible to give God a name. Now, God has given names about himself. He has revealed his name, in many ways throughout the Bible. But if you were to ask who's the first person to give God a name, naming God, well, it's this person, Hagar, a woman in the Bible who's not even a Jew, who comes from Egypt, and not a king, or a queen, or not a leader, but simply a servant serving as a slave, in a house. She gets to be the first person to give God a name. And second of all, if you were to ask the question, who is the first person who gets a visitation from an angel? We read about, many characters in the Bible, coming into contact with an angel. Daniel, it could be Abraham, Moses, and Mary. So many characters, they come into contact with an angel. But this person is the first one in the Bible who gets visited by an angel for all the characters. And she is not a queen. She is not a leader, like I said before, and she's not a prophetess. She's not anyone significant, even in a spiritual sense. And you know what? She's not even a Jew. She comes from Egypt, and she probably grew up hearing about the Egyptian gods, and so her faith is not even in the God of Israel. She probably grew up, hearing about the Egyptian gods. But she gets to be the first one, to name God. So what is the story of Hagar? That's what we're going to look at. And the title of my message is the very name that Hagar gave to God. And the name, as we read, is Elroy. And Elroy means the God who sees. And I want to speak about God as Elroy this morning, and how its relevance to our lives is something we need to really take hold of, because it changes, our perspective to life, and it changes how we approach our Christian life. So the story of Hagar, let's go through the story in stages. What is the story of Hagar? Well, first we read about Hagar having a very interesting encounter in the story with an angel. But how did she get to that point? Well, you read the story, you realize that Hagar is in a very hostile situation, in her workplace. And her workplace is where? Abraham and Sarah's house. She's working there as a slave. And the backstory is that Abraham and Sarah are just terribly impatient because they've been waiting for a promised child, from God. They've not been able to have a child of their own, and so they receive a promise from God that they will have a child. And so they've been waiting for far too long, and it's been about maybe even 10 years that they still haven't seen this promise come to pass. And so they're growing anxious, and they're growing upset, and they feel like giving up. They're discouraged at this point. And Sarah comes up with a plan. She's thinking, we've waited far too long. How long do we wait? Maybe God didn't mean exactly what we are thinking he meant. Yes, God, has promised a child, but maybe we have to do something about it. We got to take practical steps, So as we take action, as we do something, maybe then God will fulfill his promise. So she comes up with a plan to help God, fulfill a promise he gave. And she comes up with a terrible plan. And her plan is that, she wants Hagar, the servant in the house, the slave in the house, to be used as a surrogate mother to have a child. I wonder how that conversation went. We read about it in the story. She goes to Abraham and she says, I think what we have to do is we have to use Hagar, our slave, as a servant, as a surrogate mother. It's been far too long. And maybe through her, we'll have our child. And that's how God is going to fulfill this promise. And then, the Bible also tells us Abraham hearkened, heeded, to her voice. He should have said, no, Sarah, this is not the way to go. We have to wait on God. We have to believe in God for His promise to be fulfilled. We can't get ahead of God. And not only that, it's also wrong on many other levels. We shouldn't be breaking our marriage covenant. He didn't say any of that. He was okay with the plan. It says he hearkened to her voice. And then we read Hagar was used as a surrogate mother, and she she becomes pregnant. And as she becomes pregnant, we don't know why, but we read that she begins to despise Sarah. Hagar begins to despise Sarah. And maybe it's because she's thinking, this is my child, I'm carrying. Why should I be simply used as a vessel for you to have, a child? Why am I being used? And so maybe she begins to hate Sarah for that reason. That, Sarah, you're being selfish. This is my child. The child belongs to me. Or maybe she begins to despise Sarah because in those times it was considered to be a curse, to not be able to bear a child. And so she used that, to look down on her or to feel superior to her. And maybe she was giving some insults in a passive way. We don't exactly know, but we read that she was despising Sarah. And Sarah, she couldn't bear this. She was enraged by this sudden change in behavior from Hagar. And she goes to Abraham and says, we can't let this go on anymore. She's acting this way with me, and she's treating me this way. We have to do something about this. And what does Abraham say? He says, well, she's your servant. You take care of her. I'm not getting into all this, Do with her as you like. And then we read Sarah starts treating Hagar so harshly that Hagar is driven to a point where all she can think of is running away from this house. And she's thinking, I cannot bear this anymore. I can't take this treatment anymore. There's only one thing left for me to do. I want to run away from this house, run as far as possible. And I don't know where I'm going to run to, but I have to run. I know I'm pregnant, but this is my only option. And so we read, she runs away from the house. And as she's running away from the house, we read that she finds herself in a wilderness, in a desert. And then there's a spring. And there's a spring, where she stops, maybe because she wants, some water. For your own survival, people, when they were in the wilderness, they would stop at, any spring they found. And so she was there. And maybe she's thinking about her whole life, right from the beginning till this point. And she's thinking, what kind of a life have I had? My entire life. She's thinking, nobody has really cared me for who I am. Nobody has really cared for me. Because she's probably looking back and thinking, I come from Egypt. And Pharaoh gave me as a slave gift to Abraham and Sarah. And so I was sent out as a slave to Abraham and Sarah. And then I'm working here in this house. I worked so hard. And then Sarah gives me to Abraham as a surrogate mother, and I'm used there in that sense. And then Abraham says to Sarah, you know what, you do with her as you please. And so I'm back with Sarah, and Sarah's, she starts treating me harshly. Why is it that everybody just keeps tossing me around? Pharaoh gives me to this family, and within this family, they're tossing me around, and now I'm just here. There's nobody really there to care for me. And that's the question, perhaps. Is there really someone, who cares for me? And that's the moment an angel steps in and comes with a message. And the angel comes with a reply to that very question. The angel says, yes, Hagar, there is someone who cares about you, and I've come with a message from him. And that's the first time, God steps into her life with an answer to her question, with an answer to the cry of her heart. And the angel gives her a beautiful promise. The angel comforts her. The angel tells her, a little bit about her future. But the angel, for the most part, tells her that there is a God who cares about you, and there is a God who sees you. And that is the setting in which Hagar gives this name to God. She says, now I know that there is a God. Not only that there is a God, but there is a God who sees me. And she names him Elroy. And for the first time, in that moment where she is all by herself, she has finally discovered a person who truly sees her and truly cares for her, for who she is. Somebody who's not going to toss her around. Somebody who sees her. And she says, I've now seen the one who sees me, Elroy, the God who sees me. So here's the first thing, I want to tell you. The foundation in her life changed in that moment. The foundation of her life about not being seen, about not being acknowledged and cared for, it changed in that moment. God became the foundation for her in that moment. The first thing that I want to tell you about discovering God as Elroy is that God should be our foundation for this need. Elroy must be our foundation for our need to be seen, our need to be acknowledged, our need to be understood. Whatever this need is, along the lines of being seen and being acknowledged and being understood, God should be the foundation. No man or no person should take that place. God must be the foundation. Where we say, God, if you have seen me, that's enough. If you have acknowledged me, that's enough. If you have understood me, that's enough. And you know what surprised Hagar the most? Hagar grew up she worked, for quite some time in Abraham and Sarah's house. And so she would have heard so much about the God of Israel from Abraham and Sarah. And she has known all along that God is all-powerful. Likely she has known that God is all-seeing, God is omniscient. She probably knows all this. But you know what's so unique about this name that she gives to God? It's not just the fact that she says, God, I know you are all-seeing. But it's when she says, God, you're a God who sees me. The God who sees me. It's one thing to say God is all-seeing, but it's another when you realize God sees me. And she realizes God has seen everything that I've gone through. He has seen my past. He has seen every detail that I've suffered. He's seen my tears. He's seen my prayers. He's seen my heartache. And for the first time, she gains a foundation that God has seen me. A businessman called Richard Uzzi, he speaks about how shallow the world is, and I don't think he's even a Christian. He says, when he was struggling in his business in the starting stage, nobody paid attention to him. His friends, his family, nobody really cared for him. And he said, maybe the reason is because I was driving a Honda Accord. And he says, I say this because after I became successful in business, I got a better car. I got a Lamborghini. And after that, everyone's paying attention to me. Everybody wants to talk to me. And he says, I realize how shallow the world is, how shallow the world's validation is. What is he saying? He's saying the world's validation, people's validation will always be shallow. It'll never be enough. It'll never suffice. God has to be the foundation for the need to be seen, for the need to be acknowledged and understood. It's like, think of a phone. We all look at our phones, so much. We do so much on our phones. But what happens when the phone is switched off? We're not looking at the phone anymore. Right? We would have spent a lot of time looking at the phone, but the moment the phone is switched off, there's nothing to look at. It's just blank. You're not looking at the phone anymore. And that's how it is, in the world. As long as you're bright, as long as you're shining, as long as you're producing or performing, maybe you're noticed, you're seen, but not so with God. God sees you because He loves you and He made you. Your foundation may it only be in God for this need to be seen. And Hagar discovered that on that day. This is important because, for some of us, maybe at work we experience this. Maybe you've worked really hard in your job, but maybe you've realized that you're not really being recognized. Maybe you've not given the visibility, to your boss, to the people you're working for. I don't know, but you may feel sometimes that, man, I've worked hard, but I'm just not being acknowledged. I'm just not being seen. And God comes to you as Elroy. May He be the foundation for your need to be seen. What gives you the strength, to continue doing the good work? It's when you say, God, you see it, and that is enough. You understand me. You know every detail. You know how I am, and you know what I do, and that is enough. I'm leaving my case in your hands. You're the God who sees me, what others don't see, and what others fail to understand. And this is also true with our pain. Sometimes the pain we carry, we feel like we're not understood. We feel like we can't express it sometimes. But you can say you have a God who sees the pain, every detail of it, and He knows every part of it. Charles Spurgeon, he said, you are looked at by God as much as if throughout space there were not another creature but yourself. That is how God looks at you, as if you're the only one who exists. And you notice one thing about Hagar, as we go into the story, we'll see she's been given a promise, she's been given a blessing, and she's been told about a good future for her, child. Of course, some hard truth about the conflict the child will be in. But she's being blessed. It's a message of blessing from an angel. But do you know what she's really fixated on? More than the blessing and the promise, what she's really caught up with is that the God of heaven would come to me and speak to me. That the God of heaven would see me and He would express His love to me. That's what has shaken her. More than the promise, more than the blessing, what has really gripped her heart is that God is so personal and God wants to answer my question, does anyone care for me? She's thinking, God, who am I that you should speak to me and tell me that you care for me? Who am I that you should come to me? She found a new foundation in her life. The need to be seen, the need to be acknowledged and understood and cared for. She found God as the foundation for this. And she realizes perhaps in that moment, God is not going to toss her around like all the people have tossed her around in her life. So that's from Hagar's encounter. What was Hagar's choice of name? I want you to notice that as well. What was her choice of name? Now look at it. It says, she called God El-ROI, which means the God who sees me. Now she's very, very, very specific about the word sees. She didn't say the God who forgives me. She didn't say the God who delivers me or the God who cares for me, the God who rescues me. No, she says the God who sees me. You know why? Because the deepest pain of her heart was not being seen. That was the deepest pain of her heart. And she says, the deepest pain of my heart, that's what God met with in that moment. Her deepest pain was met with a deeper love. It's the love of God. And that's why it's not just the God who rescues me or forgives, but the God who sees me. Because that was her deepest and greatest cry. God chooses our deepest pain as the place of His deepest encounter with us. Your deepest pain will be the place of encounter with God. C.S. Lewis, one of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century, for decades he wrote brilliantly about God and about why it is intellectually justified to believe in God. He was one of the greatest apologists. And he even spoke about suffering and how suffering doesn't disprove God, but rather it proves that God exists. And he spoke about it, with a safe intellectual distance. And then his wife, Joy, died of cancer in 1960. And he kept a raw journal of his grief, and he wrote a book on it called A Grief Observed. And that's where he wrote about his deepest pain. And he writes by saying, it felt like God, slammed His door against me and he bolted that door. That's how he writes it. But then somewhere along the way, there's a shift that happens. He wrote that God broke the silence of my grief, not with answers, but with his presence. And he said the encounter with God that he experienced was more real in this grief than anything he had known in times of comfort. His encounter with God was more deep and real in grief than in times of comfort. And he said, back then I had old, safe ideas about God, which were like a house made of cards. But my grief knocked that house down so that I can build a much stronger, a surer house of a personal relationship with God in its place. C.S. Lewis is saying, my deepest encounter with God happened in my deepest pain. God chooses that to be the place where he becomes most intimate with us, in our times of pain. And that's why for Hagar, her deepest pain was not being seen, and God became the answer to that pain. The God who sees me, the God who won't toss me around. What is the name that you may give to God, from your own story? What is the deepest pain that you have carried looking back at your past? That may be the place where God meets with you most deeply. That is the place where you may discover God to be your personal God. You may say, maybe it's the God who delivered me, the God who rescued me from suicide. Maybe the God who changed my circumstance. What is the name you might want to give to God based on your life circumstance? So you see how the name was born? The name was born when her deepest pain was met with God. Joni, at the age of 17, and I always love sharing a story. I've shared it before a few years ago. At the age of 17, she went swimming with a sister and she took a dive into the water, not knowing the water wasn't deep enough, and so she hit the bottom and she had a diving accident. And from that point onwards, she had to be in a wheelchair because she was paralyzed. And she speaks about how in those times of darkness, in those times of questions, she couldn't understand why God would allow such a tragedy. And she says, there was a moment that came one day when God asked me a question, and God said, Joni, if I loved you enough to die for you, then don't you think I can be trusted even with this tragedy? And she said, I slowly began to climb out of my depression because I began to see that Jesus was with me. And you know what? She makes a staggering statement. She says, I hope I can take my wheelchair to heaven with me one day. What an absurd thing to say. Why would you take your wheelchair to heaven? She says, I know it's not biblically correct, but if I was able, I would have my wheelchair up in heaven right next to me, where God gives me my new glorified body. Why? She says, because I would turn to Jesus and I would say, Lord, do you see that wheelchair right there? You were right when you said that in this world we would have trouble, because that wheelchair was a lot of trouble. But Jesus, the weaker I was in that wheelchair, the harder I leaned on you. The harder I leaned on you, the stronger I discovered you to be. So thank you for what you did in my life through that wheelchair. And now you can send that wheelchair to hell if you want. Her own words. She's saying her deepest pain became a place of her deepest encounter with God. Each of us should meet God in that place. Each of us have our own pain, and we must not waste that pain, allow that pain to be wasted. We must meet with God in that place of pain, and we will discover the greatness and the sufficiency of who God is. So that our pain is not dismissed, but dissolved in the greatness of His presence. Meet with God in the place of your pain, because that is the place God chooses to meet with us and have His deepest encounter with us. The story doesn't end there. Hagar gets a command. Look at verse 7. Hagar gets a command. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. And the angel said to her, Hagar, Sarah's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? Beautiful questions. Where have you come from and where are you going? Two questions that God asks us as well. The first one deals with our past, second deals with our future. Where have you come from? God asks this question too. What's been your past? What has happened to you? Where have you come from? What is the pain that you want me to heal? What do you want me to cleanse you from? What is it that you are stuck in that you want me to free you from? Where have you come from? God asks the same question about our past. And he also asks, where are you going? Where are you heading? What is your direction in life? Are you having your own plan that you want to pursue? Is that where you want to go? Where have you come from and where are you going? Hagar responds. She says, I have run away from my master's house. An opportunity for her to confess what has happened to her. And then the command comes in verse 9. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress, your master's house, and submit to Sarah's authority. Submit to her authority. I'm thinking, how did Hagar receive that command from this angel? You would expect Hagar to say, Lord, how can you send me back to that house? You know what's happened. I just told you where I come from and you know what's happened. How can you send me back there? You know how I suffer. How do you ask me to submit to the very person who has harmed me so much? And yet that's the command. And you know what? She doesn't ask any questions. She doesn't resist. She doesn't say, how can I go back to that place? They hate me. She has none of those questions. No resistance. She obeys the will of God. How was she able to do that? How was she able to do such a hard will of God? We speak about doing God's will, but there are certain things that God asks us to do which are harder than the others. God, I can do these 8 things, but this 9th thing, well, that is too hard. You can't ask me of that. You can't ask me to do that. And yet Hagar did. Why was she able to do that? Because she is in a place of encounter with God. When you are in a place of a true encounter with God, you can do the hard will of God. We cannot do the will of God unless we encounter God and find Him to be more than enough for us. That's the third thing. We can't do the will of God unless we find ourselves in an encounter with Him and we realize He is more than enough for me. And whatever He asks of me, even if it's difficult, I think I can do it. So sometimes doing God's will can prove difficult, but it's possible when we are encountered by God in secret. Where do you encounter God? Where do we encounter God? Let me quote Jesus to you, Matthew 6, verse 6. Jesus says, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. That is your place of encounter with God. Your secret room, your secret place with God, that is your place of encounter with God. One of the rooms in your house, I don't know which room it is, but that will be your place of encounter with God. When you shut the door behind you and when it is only you alone with God, that is a secret place. And in that place, you stay there long enough, you will discover He is more than enough. He is all that I need. He is the answer to every question I've had. My future is in His hands. So what is it that He wants me to do? Even if it is hard, it doesn't strike me as hard as anymore because I'm so preoccupied with God's presence and with who He is. And that overtakes the hard things He asks me to do. That's why you don't see Hagar resisting. No, she is caught up and preoccupied with the sweetness of God who has encountered her. And she's able to say, Lord, anything for you. Lord, you're the God who sees me. You're the God who loves me. And now you're telling me that you've got a future plan for me and my child. Lord, you tell me. I will do it. Even the hard things that we find difficult to do for God, we become able to do it when we are in a place of encounter with God. And we find Him to be more than enough. And you know what? Jesus actually said Do it all in secret. Pray in secret for your father to see you. Give in secret for your father to see you. Fast in secret, let your father see you. Do your good works in secret. It's a pattern. Jesus said, do all this for your father to see you. For your father to see you, not to be seen by others. And Hagar discovered that day, I don't have to do anything anymore to be seen or to be acknowledged by Sarah or by Abraham. I only want to be seen by God. I only want to be acknowledged by God. God rewards us for what we do in private more than what we do in public. How we are and what we do in private, God rewards us more for that. And where I fail the most, in private. Where we fail the most, it's in our private. And that's where God wants to change us. That's where the Father sees us, and He wants us to live our Christian life more authentically, in private. The secret place is the secret to doing God's will. The story continues, not just a command. Hagar finally receives a promise. You look at verse 10. Verse 10, it says, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And then the angel also said, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. And this son of yours will be a wild man, untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. And yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. But I will bless his descendants. Descendants, more than you can count. And a wonderful name is given to a child, Ishmael. What does the name mean? Ishmael. It means God has heard your cry of distress. God hears. And the angel says he's going to be like a wild donkey. Is that a compliment? Can I say that about like you? Or can you say that about me? Ashwin, you're going to be like a wild donkey. Keep it going. You don't compliment anyone in that way. But here, a wild donkey speaks about independence. You're going to be a man of your own making. You're not going to be a slave to anyone. You're going to be blessed in that way. You're going to be a man of independence. And that's how it is meant here. But then also speaks about the conflict. There's going to be some conflict, though. People will raise their fist against you. And you may raise your fist against others. And you know who Ishmael is? It's the forefather of, the Arab world, the Arab people. And yes, till today we see the conflict that always surrounds, the people there. Goes back to Ishmael, the father of the Arab people. But yet there is a blessing, that God gives, for Hagar's sake. So how is Hagar receiving all this? Hagar can't believe it because, when she looks back at her past, all she can see is uncertainty. One after the other, uncertainty. She was living in Egypt. All of a sudden, she's sent to Abraham and Sarah's house. Changing times all of a sudden. And all of a sudden, she's being used as a surrogate mother. Throughout her life, she has faced uncertainty one after the other. Full of uncertainties. And you know what she's actually hearing now? She's hearing that she doesn't have to worry about her future anymore. She doesn't have to worry about her child anymore. Her future is going to be handled by God. That's what she's hearing. She's able to trust God. She found El-ROI in the moment of uncertainty. Even now, as she is at the spring in the desert, she doesn't know where she's going to go. Who's going to come and help me? It's a moment of uncertainty, and God steps into that moment of uncertainty. El-ROI is the God you can trust today for all the uncertainties of tomorrow. Let me repeat. El-ROI, the God of Hagar, is the God you trust today for all the uncertainties you feel about tomorrow. Because you know what happens to Hagar as you continue reading? She goes back to the house. The son grows up. And eventually they move out of the house and they're on their way again in the desert to move to another place. Still under the guidance of God. And all of a sudden her water runs out. Her water runs out. It's like, happens to us too. Especially in this season, we're heading out, we don't want to head out without water. We want a water bottle with us all the time. So many times, Janet has sent me back to the house to bring the water bottle back before we leave the house. We're not leaving without the bottle. So they're on their way, and all of a sudden, water runs out. And then the boy, Ishmael, becomes extremely thirsty. And the boy begins to cry, and all of a sudden, panic sets in. Sometimes it's just water. You just have to wait. You may find water sooner or later. But here in this situation, I think Hagar begins to panic, because where will she find water? It's a time of uncertainty, and the boy is crying, he's thirsty, and she begins to panic. And you know what happens when you panic, right? You exaggerate the situation to the maximum. That's what happens when you panic. If you feel a pain, lung cancer. You exaggerate it, to the maximum. There's a thought, what if it's lung cancer? And she panics and she exaggerates. And you know what she says? This is all there in chapter 21. You can read at home. She says, I don't want to watch my boy die. And she burst into tears. And even in that time of uncertainty, it says, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God again came to Hagar from heaven. The angel must be thinking, whenever she has a need, I'm being sent to Hagar. So Hagar is visited by an angel again, and the message from God, Hagar, what is wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him. And again the promise, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. And then in verse 19, chapter 21, it says, God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw suddenly a well full of water. And she quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. I don't know how she didn't see that well before. Did it supernaturally appear after, God sent this angel? Maybe. Or was she so panic-stricken that she missed the big well that was standing right there in front of her? We don't know. But there's a well, she discovers, and she gives the water to her boy. And as he drinks water, I can imagine Hagar looking at her boy, sipping the water. She's thinking to herself, again, it's the God who sees me, the God who sees us. Even a simple need, like the uncertainty of not being able to find water, God is willing to step into my moment of uncertainty and give me the assurance that He is by my side. Why should I be afraid? Why should I be worried? I only need to ask God for what I need. Alexander McLaren, he says, if God sends us on stony paths, He will provide us with strong shoes. For some of you, you're facing uncertainties, maybe in the present, maybe more in the future. And God wants you to discover Him as your Elroy today. And I just close with this illustration. Sometimes when I'm traveling by train, I see strange things. I mean, I always see strange things. And this one time I saw a guy who was sleeping, on his berth, and he had his hands up. Both the hands were up, and he was sleeping. And it didn't look like he was praying. And I was in college at the time, and I was not a believer, I believe, at the time. And I saw this man, he's put his hands up, and I'm thinking, is he praying? I don't know what's going on. And he's just lying there on his back, eyes closed, he's sleeping, and both his hands are up. And he's not moving at all, and it's a very strange sight, to see. And I just walked past, let me ignore. So I just used the restroom, and then I'm walking back again, and I take a look, and he's in the same position. And I just ran away from that place, never going back there. I see a lot of strange things, happening on the train. But one thing I see every time I travel on the train, when I go to Kerala to visit my parents, I always see people who are just running about here and there, in panic, uncertainty. Why? Because their tickets are not confirmed. And, they've bought the tickets, but they want to get them confirmed. And so they are searching for, the TTR. They are just running about. And then I look at myself. I'm sitting very comfortably, in my ticket, in my seat. Why? It's confirmed. Nobody can take my seat. At least, some of the trains. Other times you have to fight. No, this is my seat. Yeah. So I'm just sitting there comfortably, and I see so many others, they're also sitting very comfortably. What is the difference? People who have confirmed ticket, people who don't have a confirmed ticket, That's the certainty, right? That's the factor that differentiates. that our place is secure, our seat is secure. Why? It's confirmed. It's not going to be taken away. And I just use that as an example to say, how does God's grace work in our lives? I think God's grace is like a confirmed ticket, a place of security, a place of safety. But imagine if I'm running around in panic with a confirmed ticket. How absurd I'd look. I just have to be told, no, you have a confirmed ticket. Your place is secure. Your place is safe. And sometimes that's what the Bible reminds us. If you're in God, if you have your faith in God, isn't your place secure? Isn't your foundation secure? Isn't your safety in God's hands? Why should you be worried? Do you not have God, El-ROI, the God who is watching over you, the God who sees it all, the God who knows all your needs? And if he has to give you water, he'll send an angel. No matter how many times the angel has to go, you'll get your water. That's the lesson Hagar learned. And she gave a beautiful name to God, Elroy, the God who sees. I just want to close with this poem, and then we're going to worship God, and then we're going to pray and close. So listen to this poem. Until I learned to trust, I did not learn to pray. And I did not learn to fully trust till sorrows came my way. Until I felt my weakness, his strength I never knew, nor dreamed till I was stricken that he would see me through. Who deepest drinks of sorrow, drinks deepest too of grace. He sends the storm so he himself can be our hiding place. Discover God as your Elroy, the God who sees you, the God who can handle all the uncertainties that you're feeling, and place your faith in God. Rest in God. And God says, don't be afraid. Why should you be worried? And may you each day find the place of encounter with him in your secret place. That is where we find the strength, to live our Christian life. Can we close our eyes and pray?